Hi Year 11s. Just thought that I would speak through the PowerPoint to help you unpack and understand the short story of Abbreviation. It's the second story that we're having a look at in Tim Winton's book, The Turning. We've done Big World and now we're going to move on with Abbreviation. Just like we did with Big World, we're going to try and unpack things that are happening within the story, because the more we know about the story, the easier it will be for us to creatively respond to it. So let's have a look at the first task that I'd like you to do once you've reread the story, or if you haven't reread it or you'd like to reread it with the help of an audio file, I've put an MP3 version of someone narrating that to you up on Compass as well. So please feel free to have it read to you by somebody else. All right. The first thing that we're going to do, though, is we're going to concentrate on the plot. And for those of you who are in my class, you'll understand what I mean when I say we're going to do an evidence hunt. That means as we're reading, we're looking for specific things in the text so that we're starting to use quotes straight away. The first thing, like with Big World, is that we'll see that the setting is really important. We know that Winton finds the setting in his stories really important, and he writes them in such a way that reflects them as quite powerful, almost personified. So I want you to be looking for evidence of the way that nature comes into play. And once again, we can see where the coastline is really important to Winton, as this one is set on the beach as well. I'd like you to see if you can find in the story the year that was set. Once you understand what year the story was set in, when you go to respond to it creatively yourself, you're going to need to do a little bit of research into that era as well. It's quite a little bit before the boys get in the combi in Big World, because in their story we hear that Vic, the policeman's son, actually ducks the year. So this is way before that, but there is definitely evidence in the text of knowing what year it is. I'd like you to have a look at the main characters. There's a few characters in this particular story that we could really get our teeth into. Certainly Vic is one of those, but it is written, even though it's in the third person narrative, it's written from Vic's perspective. So I challenge you to find another character within the story that you could write from. Now, the first thing that would come to mind, obviously, is the character of Melanie. She is pivotal, and I would say she's the female protagonist in this particular story. She's really important to the plot and the running of the story. But have a think about the more peripheral characters that are involved as well. We've got Vic's nana, we've got his old man, we've got Ernie and his wife Cleo, and then of course we've got Mum and the baby. So all of these are things that are characters that we know a fair bit about through the text. So have a look and list the characters, and then think about the way that they've actually been described in the story. I'd like you to think about how old Vic is, because the story obviously revolves around him at that age, and so when we write creatively about it, that's going to come into play as well. Bit of a bonus question as we're dealing with the plot and the characters in this story. Why is the title called Abbreviation? Now, you might all go immediately to the fact that Melanie calls her stumped finger an abbreviation, but can you find a deeper understanding to why abbreviation might be used as the title? I'll give you a hint. Go and have a look at the dictionary and see what abbreviation is defined as, and see if you can use the text to justify a variety of reasons why it may be called abbreviation. Then we're going to fill in our table, and we had the luxury of being able to do that as a group in my class last term because we were together. Now we're not together, but certainly I'll be having this conversation with my class of filling in the different boxes. So have a go at doing it first. But I want you to use the evidence hunt that you've done through the text to have a look at the big ideas, and then of course the key features of Winton's writing. The three big ideas I'd like you to look at in this story is gender roles. Now, the era that this particular story has been written out of had definite ideas about the role of a man and the role of a woman in society. And this story reflects that really clearly. So I'd like you to have a look at that. Again, it's more than just the description of the setting, but how does Winton bring nature into a powerful front? How do we feel that nature really does take over at points and is in control? And then, of course, we've got the all-important turning point. We know the book is called The Turning. It's about change. It's about movement. So thinking about the characters that you've listed, where are their turning points? Vix is, you could vote for quite a few different parts in the story for Vic's turning point. But we spoke as a class about the fact that to turn something, or if you think about it in turning a piece of wood, it is to change its shape or to mold it into a different form. And I'd really like you to take that definition when you're thinking about the turning points in the text, because your creative response is going to need to have a turning point, because that is one of the pivotal things about this text that we're going to be looking for you to create. And then, of course, the bottom table here is about the key features of the way that Winton writes. I need some quotes about the description of the setting, about how he characterizes people, how does he bring them to life on stage, and then finally, what is so important about the dialogue that's going on in the text? What does it reveal about a character? How do we know it's dialogue when Winton chooses not to use speech marks? So have a go at filling in that particular table, and we're going to have a chat about it in class. Before we get into analytically responding to the text, I'd like you to think about how we can categorize or label certain things that are going on in the story. It's really important for us to understand the way that Winton does certain things. So I've given you some key words here that you can go into the text from. Narrative perspective is going to be very important, just as description of the setting is going to be really important. We've got characterization here, which is very important as well. And again, dialogue. Now, these are all things, and if we take change as a turning point, these are all things that you've dealt with in this previous slide here. So we've got a head start on this categorization already. But I'd like you also to think about the way who might be the protector in this particular story. What information can we infer? What are the new experiences that are happening? Not just the one between Vic and Melanie on the beach, but certainly there are more new experiences happening there as well. How do we know that Ernie is a chauvinist? Who comes to realizations about things? And certainly this story is about growing up, but not just for Vic. So have a look at these different categories: stereotypes, peaceful, escape, and think about where you might be able to justify those labels so that you can write a short reflection on the story of Abbreviation. The reflection should be about what is Winton trying to push forward about this story? What messages are being contained within the story? We need to know what those messages are, because you're going to have to create those messages in your own writing as well. So as long as we know what they are, we can recreate them. So be as specific as you can in your evidence hunt in creating your reflection about the overall intention of Winton in regards to this story. We should respond to things analytically as well, because if we can get to the deeper understanding of what's happening in the story, then you'll be able to create that in your own writing. The thing I'd like you to think about with Abbreviation is the events that lead us to change. Events that are triggered by love, or events that are triggered by pain. Melanie is certainly an interesting character when you think about the changing of who she might have been because of the events in her life that have caused her pain. But I'd like you to think about Vic and how he changes through this particular story? How would he reflect on it later, you know, maybe 6 months down the track? And that might help you come up with a creative response as well. Speaking of creative responses, let's have a look at the ways that we might be able to respond to this particular one. Cleo was a character that I was intrigued by, so I thought maybe you could create Cleo's story of why she went from Cloris to Cleo. Cloris, to start with, is not really a typical name. So where did the name Cloris actually come from? Who gave it to her? Is there a history behind that name? And then what was the turning point or the trigger that made her want to name herself after a fashion magazine, Cleo? When did the change happen? How old was she when this particular situation happened for her as well? It's certainly a turning point story. You could also write the late night milk run between Vic's old man and his nana. His nana, who is most definitely protective and biased towards Ernie, but his dad gets Ernie out of problems all of the time. So that milk run might be interesting from either of those perspectives. And perhaps that's the turning point where Vic's old man decides that he's not going to fish Ernie out anymore, but he's actually going to become a policeman. We know that there'd have to be a turning point in his life where that happens, so that might be an interesting idea. You could create a story about the two brothers or two young boys, if you're going to do it as an original piece, when they were young, that reveals why Ernie is in fact the favourite. Maybe it involves pain or tragedy in some way that helps Nana really connect to Ernie, and hence that's why he's the favourite, the turning point for Nana, if you will. You've also got Melanie's perspective that you can take a look at. There's several places in the story that you could do Melanie's perspective, but a couple of them I thought about would be watching Vic get dumped by the surf, and then how she decides that she's going to get up on the surfboard as well. And is there an embarrassment when she can't actually surf very well either? And then, of course, there's the New Year's Eve encounter in the bushes that you might like to do from Melanie's perspective. Of course, keep it very well PG rated for me. That would be great. Thank you. You can also write the story of how Melanie lost her fingers in the baler. How old was she? Was she doing something that she shouldn't have been doing? We know that she was. She just wanted to see how fast it moved. And then, of course, you've got the new text type that you could create. You could create a news article on the depleting coastline due to the increase of campers on the beach and the mistreatment of nature. We know that they're doing that because he goes to speak to Melanie at the end and they've just left their litter laying everywhere. So you might like to think of a completely different text type, but it's still creative about that. And maybe this particular newspaper article calls for a turning point, calls for a change in habit. And that's how you would tie the turning in. You've got Ernie and Vic's dad's perspective of the capsizing of the boat. We see it through Vic's perspective, but what if the story was rewritten from either of those men? And then you could create or continue the story of Melanie's family packing up, and then what does the trip home to the farm look like? What is she worried about? Why did they leave? Those kind of questions could in fact be answered. So that's abbreviation and how I'd like you to head into the book. So from here, I'd like you to go and reread the story, thinking about the table and the labels that I want you to do with that particular story so that we can then have a good class discussion about it. And then have a little bit of think of the creative way that you might like to respond to this. All right, thanks very much, and I shall see you soon.